So the first, and I think maybe the primary thing that people always appeal to is this: the language of near and quickly that are utilized in Revelation seem to indicate that Jesus is going to come back immediately or quickly, or he's going to come back in that generation, right? And now sometimes preterists will unfortunately appeal to their understanding of Matthew 24 and say, well, look, we know Matthew 20, our understanding of Matthew 24 is correct. Therefore, Revelation is probably meaning this. Okay. So let's try to divide that for a second and just assess Revelation on its own terms. There's plenty we could talk about with Matthew 24. Absolutely. But let's just assess Revelation. So there are typically these three words that are appealed to. You have takus or takos, a form which means quickly or suddenly. You have engus, which means near. For example, in Revelation 1:3, we have that being mentioned. I'm just going to pull it up here on my screen. So in Revelation 1:3, it says, "Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear and who keep what is written, for the time is near." Okay, so that's that word there, engus. And that's also bookended in Revelation 22:10. So if you go to Revelation 22:10, for example, you would have the same kind of phrase there. So he said to me, "Do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this book, for the time is near." Now, I remember there were multiple comments in some of the videos that said this was definitive for them. When John is saying that the time is near, engus, the time is near, that means that we can't be looking thousands of years down the timeline, because that would be, unqualifiable. That's not what John means. Near means near, which means it has to be within a few years of when John was writing. Okay, now that's the presupposition. We're going to look at that in just a little bit. But something we need to understand is that whatever you take for these temporal words that are used in Revelation actually spans the entire book. So if you look at, for example, Revelation 1:1, you get the same kind of quickly language. So it says, the revelation of Jesus Christ, this is Revelation 1:1, which God gave him to show to his servants the things that must soon take place. He made it known by sending his angel to his servant John. So notice that phrase, must soon take place. Okay. So that idea there, that suddenness, that quickness that's happening there. Well, okay, that's Revelation 1:1. And actually it's framed in Revelation 22:6, 7, 12, and 20. That same word, that cognate, is used there as well, which indicates that whatever we're talking about in Revelation 22 must also soon take place. Okay, does that make sense? Basically, the big point here is that the idea of things being near, Revelation 1:3 and Revelation 22:10, it frames it with engus there. But then the takos word group as well, if you want to, I'm using the Greek term, but if you want to remember it, it's just like Taco Tuesday. The Taco Tuesday word group, that's also being framed at the beginning and end of Revelation. We have Revelation 1:1 as well as Revelation 22 verses 7, 12, 20, etc. So what that means then, as we're framing this, is that everything that takes place in that context has to come to play. It has to come to pass soon, which would be, for example, preterists and amillennialists will both argue that Satan has been chained, right? In Revelation 20, he's been chained. But Revelation 20 also talks about the release of Satan. And has Satan been released? Well, that's what we're talking about in Revelation 22. It says all these things must soon take place. Well, I can't think of any post-millennialist or amillennialist who would say that Satan has currently been released from his imprisonment, right? So it would be a sense of the final release of Satan, the final judgment talked about in Revelation 20, 11 through 15. I mean, all these things, and the new heavens and new earth. Now it's actually becoming more and more popular in the preterist viewpoint to actually argue that Revelation 21 and 22 are being fulfilled. And that's actually really concerning to myself and many others, because that is a very slippery slope into full preterism, denying the actual return of Jesus Christ and the resurrection, as we have seen in the case of Gary DeMar and others who follow in his footsteps or who have led him in those ways. So once you start down that road where you're saying, well, Revelation 21, 22 are not a reference to the eternal state or to the new Jerusalem, our expectation of eternity, it's actually to our current existence, well, you got huge problems. So I think most of my listeners would not hold to Revelation 21 and 22 being a reference to our current experience. There are probably a few of you, and we are all entitled to our own opinion. But I think for the by and large, most partial preterists that I deal with and am friends with would not hold to Revelation 21, 22 being currently experienced. It is the eternal state. But Revelation 22 says that these things are near, they must soon come to pass. Okay. So contextually, and actually, by the way, I'm not much into confessions, as this sounds weird to say, but it's just true. I don't spend my time reading them a lot, but I do want to do some series on them at some point. And my understanding of the Westminster Confession of Faith, if I remember correctly, is that they actually cite Revelation 22 as a expectation of the future return of Christ, not as something that has been fulfilled in 70 AD. So even within the confessions, if you claim to be a confessional Christian, which a lot of preterists do, they say, hey, we hold to the Reformed confessions. Well, you're kind of going against the Westminster, at least, if you are holding to the fact that Revelation is only talking about Christ's return in 70 AD. Now, I want to really kind of put a nail in this coffin. So remember, again, what we're talking about here is you have this expectation that when John is talking about what is near, and when he's talking about what it must soon come to pass, that has to mean that things are going to happen relatively quickly within, a year, 2 years, whatever. It has to happen quickly. But listen, all you have to do is go to biblical precedents, okay? Revelation should not be attempted to be interpreted until you understand your Old Testament. And the Old Testament is replete with examples of this language, okay? Now, I just did a brief word search for these terms, and engus is a really easy one to find because it shows up so many times. And just listen to some of these verses, okay? And you know what they're talking about, okay? Deuteronomy 32, verse 35, God is revealing his future judgment against Israel. He says, vengeance is mine, and then this is the last part of the verse, for the day of their calamity is at hand. That's in the Greek translation of that verse, which is the influence upon the New Testament authors. It's engus, it's at hand, it's near, okay? So the day of their calamity is at hand and their doom comes swiftly. So again, the same kind of concept of, now he's not saying in Deuteronomy 32 that I'm going to punish them within the next couple of years. You might be inclined to think that, but he's actually talking about the far future when he's going to enact punishment upon Israel for their transgressions, okay? So same kind of concept there. The day of their calamity is at hand. Well, does that mean it's going to happen within the next couple of years? No, it doesn't, okay? No, this terminology does not mean that it has to happen immediately, okay? Joel 1:15. Okay, think about even just how the day of the Lord is talked about in the prophets. Joel 1:15 says, alas, for the day of the Lord is near, okay? And as the destruction from the Almighty, it comes. So again, the Greek translation of the Old Testament there chooses to use the word engus. Now, the people who translate the Old Testament into Greek, they're not slouches. It's not as if they don't consider word choice or how to represent these ideas. And so they're using this terminology, engus, and the day of the Lord. Well, let's put it this way. Joel is all about the day of the Lord, and at least 3 times, probably more actually, but at least 3 times, Joel talks about the day of the Lord coming and being near. Okay, being near. Joel 2:1, blow a trumpet in Zion, sound, let all the inhabitants of the earth tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming, it is near. Okay. And then Joel 3:14 and following is actually really instructive because it talks about there are multitudes and multitudes of people in the valley of decision, for the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. Well, if you go through the context, it's actually talking about the far future. Okay. So it says that the sun and moon are darkened, the stars withdraw their shining. Where have we seen that kind of language before? Yes. The Lord roars from Zion, utters his voice, the heavens and the earth quake. So you shall know that I am Lord your God who dwells in Zion. Jerusalem will be holy. Strangers will never again pass through it. In those days, mountains shall drip sweet wine. Egypt shall become a desolation, Edom a desolate place, Judah shall be inhabited forever. So it's talking about a future time where Israel is restored in blessing. And that is, the context of, hey, the day of the Lord is near. This is what's going to happen. Okay. Now that hasn't happened yet. Okay. And let's think to ourselves, by the time we get to the New Testament, had it happened? So Joel, I would date, by the way, the prophecy of Joel, I date early. Well, I mean, it's not, I think a lot of conservative scholars would date it early. A lot of the more liberal scholars would date Joel around 600, maybe a little earlier, maybe a few years later. There's a span there of 10 years or so, around 600 BC. I would date it around 800 BC, maybe even earlier than that, for a variety of reasons. We won't get into that now. But so I'm thinking Joel's written 800 BC, and by the time Jesus comes, that's 800 years later. Nothing has still happened. Okay, so now we have to ask ourselves: has the terminology of the day of the Lord being near disqualified itself if it hasn't happened in 800 years? Okay, no, we can't say that. In fact, we know the day of the Lord hasn't taken place because Paul himself in 1 Thessalonians 5:2, talking to the Thessalonians, is trying to argue them some sense into them, saying, listen, the day of the Lord hasn't happened yet because this is 1 Thessalonians 5:2, he says, you yourselves are fully aware that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. In other words, it's going to come, and it's going to come quickly, unexpectedly. You know that. Well, so how can Joel say the day of the Lord is near? And Paul says, well, it hasn't happened yet, some 800 years later. Same thing with Ezekiel, by the way. In Ezekiel chapter 30, verse 3, Ezekiel says, the day is near. The day of the Lord is near. It will be a day of clouds, a time of doom for the nations. Okay? A doom for the nations. We haven't seen that yet, right? So the day of the Lord, an interesting study, and you got to know it. You got to look for it in the Old Testament. And this kind of language of being near really solidifies the fact that you shouldn't expect something that's near to be happening right away within a couple of years. Okay. So it's just so funny. People start reading Revelation because they, are attracted to that and the debates surrounding that, but they'd really be well served just to read their Old Testaments a lot. And once you have a foundation of the Old Testament, by the time you get to John, you just see that some of this language has been used already. Okay. So what this means then, and this is what I would advocate for, the evidence seems consonant with this pretty easily, is that rather than saying that these things that John is talking about must soon come to pass, that's one way you could translate that, is it's more likely talking about coming without delay or coming quickly, okay? And this is actually how the rest of the New Testament speaks as well. You think about all the different passages that are brought up in places like even 1 Peter and James. In fact, one of my favorite passages would be at the end of James, in James 5, 8, and 9. I love the book of James. And in James 5, 8, and 9, it says, you be patient, establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. That's that same word there, that phrase. It's engidzo, the root of engus. It's near, it's at hand. And he says, do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. Okay. And then you have other passages that talk about that as well. For example, 1 Peter 4:7. And in 1 Peter 4:7, you have Peter saying, the end of all things is at hand. Well, guess what? That phrase, oftentimes in the New Testament, the translations will say at hand when it's that word engus, it's near. Okay. So the end of all things is at hand, therefore be self-controlled, sober-minded for the sake of your prayers. All right. Philippians 4:5, very similar concept for that. Philippians 4:5, let your reasonableness be known to everybody. The Lord is at hand. Okay. Now listen, this is common New Testament speak. Now the way preterism destroys the Bible, and I mean that completely, is that you could easily argue, if you already have a preconceived notion that everything is fulfilled in 70 AD, you would go to each of these passages, if you're going to be consistent, and say, oh, each of these is talking about 70 AD. Each of these is talking about 70 AD. But by doing that, you are systematically erasing any kind of expectation or looking ahead to the Lord's return. That's what you're doing. And that's why preterism is very, very dangerous. And, I've heard Doug Wilson say this, and I think it's completely accurate, actually. Imagine me saying I agree with Doug Wilson on that. But he has mentioned in some of his interviews that the attractiveness of preterism is that it can be used to answer anything. And he says that that's one of the downsides as well, because the same framework that you use to say, oh, preterism answers everything in Revelation, you could also use everywhere else in Scripture, saying, oh, preterism answers this, preterism answers that. All of this is fulfilled in 70 AD. All of this, we have no passages anymore talking about the looking ahead to the return of Christ and how we need to live in light of his imminent return. So the imminence of Christ's return is done away with. We don't expect him to return anytime soon. All of that is done away with from Scripture. And that becomes very, very dangerous. And just to be honest, that's actually one of the reasons why I'm doing this whole series, is because it's one of those challenges where I see that destroying the church, where you have people, like I mentioned in one of the last episodes, you have people who argue, oh yeah, Christ won't return for at least 100,000 years, so we have all this time to work. Well, no, the New Testament talks about watching and waiting and looking ahead for Christ's return. And it's not talking about, and a lot of these passages refer to rewards that are going to be given at the return of Christ. Well, that can't be 70 AD, right? So all that to say is that this idea of the return of the Lord being near, it cannot be a reference to 70 AD in all of these passages. And so to those who left comments on some of the previous videos regarding to the idea of nearness language, or the fact that, this is soon to take place, well, this is common language that's used both in the Old Testament as well as the New Testament, referring to the next part of God's prophetic plan. And we just need to be honest about that. We need to assess all of the evidence collectively. We can't just isolate Revelation and say, well, look, it says quickly and it has to mean immediately within the next couple of years. I mean, no, just look at all of Scripture. I mean, a lot of my preterist brothers and sisters claim to use Scripture as the final standard of authority. And so I would appeal to them to just be looking at the other uses of these kinds of terms. Yeah, you can look outside of Scripture too and see that there's a broad range of use, but just even within Scripture itself, there is a important assessment of this language. I actually pulled a quote from Sam Frost, who's a former full preterist, and he came to see the error of his ways. And he said, this is a quote, I think I got it from a social media discussion, where he said, I'm constantly amazed that soon is so readily accepted and dogmatically as the only available translation of this idea. It isn't. Quickly is another viable option. So in other words, in John, the emphasis wouldn't be on saying, oh, look for me in the next week or so. It's saying, look, it's going to be a sudden return. When you least expect it, in the words of Paul, as a thief in the night is going to be my return, And so I think that that's an important aspect of the discussion. So all that to say, in summary, this language that's used in the book of Revelation of the return of the Lord being near, or him returning soon, that's not the definitive slam dunk argument that everyone says it is. You just look at how Scripture has used those terms. And the way I tell my Old Testament students is that, when it says the day of the Lord is near in the Old Testament, it's saying that this is the next bit on the prophetic timeline. But that may happen in 1,000 years, 2,000 years. It's the next bit, but that doesn't mean that it's going to happen within the next week or anything like that. It's just the next part of the plan. It's the next stage of God's program. And so that's how we need to think in terms of those categories. All right.